The gravel crunched beneath the tires, a sound like dry bones fracturing in the deep, encroaching twilight. My driver, a man of few words and fewer expressions, steered the robust utility vehicle down a path that had long ago surrendered to the forest's slow, persistent reclamation. Trees, gnarled and ancient, leaned inward, their branches a skeletal canopy against the bruised sky, obscuring the last vestiges of the sun. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something cloying and metallic, like old coins left to rust in a forgotten box. "Blackwood?" the driver grunted, his voice a low rumble that barely pierced the vehicle's rumbling engine. He gestured with a brief, almost imperceptible tilt of his head toward the looming silhouette ahead. The Blackwood Library was not merely old. It was a scar etched upon the landscape. A monolith of dark stone, its Gothic spires clawed at the fading light, while its lower walls were swallowed by a tide of ivy that clung with a possessive grip. No welcoming glow emanated from its multitude of windows. Instead, they stared out like vacant eyes, reflecting only the deepening gloom. This was not a place of quiet scholarship, but a mausoleum of forgotten thoughts, a tomb for tales untold. I, Chen, an archivist by trade and temperament, felt a familiar tremor of anticipation, a keen edge to my usual methodical calm. My life had been a meticulous arrangement of data, a quest for order amidst chaos, and this assignment, to catalog the long-forgotten collection of Blackwood, was both a daunting challenge and an irresistible lure. I thrived on the dust of ages, on the whisper of untold histories locked within brittle pages. Yet, a subtle disquiet coiled in my gut, a premonition that this particular archive held more than just forgotten knowledge. The driver pulled up to a grand iron gate, rusted and overgrown, that stood ajar as if weary of its duty. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, immediate. It pressed in, broken only by the distant, mournful cry of an unseen bird. He helped me unload my equipment, crates of archival tools, a portable scanner, my own carefully selected reference texts. His movements were efficient, his gaze never quite meeting mine, as if he found the library itself an unwelcome presence. With a final curt nod, he climbed back into his vehicle, the gravel crunching once more as he retreated, leaving me utterly alone before the imposing edifice. A gust of stagnant air, heavy with the scent of mildewed paper, dry rot, and something else indefinable, a faint, sweet decay, enveloped me. Towering shelves, laden with silent volumes, lined the walls, receding into the gloom of the upper reaches. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grime-coated skylights far above. Tiny, frantic galaxies in the still air. My first task was to establish a base of operations. I chose a large, relatively clear table near a tall, arched window, hoping for some natural light, however meager. My breath plumed in the cold air, a testament to the pervasive chill that seeped from the very stone. Every creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of my own movements, seemed magnified, swallowed by the vast emptiness, then echoed back to me. I began my preliminary survey, a systematic exploration of the ground floor. My footsteps were hushed on the thick, dust-laden carpets. The sheer volume of material was staggering. Books lay piled on every surface, some in precarious towers, others scattered like fallen leaves. My fingers, gloved to protect the delicate pages, traced the rough texture of ancient bindings, some leather, others vellum, a few surprisingly smooth, like polished bone. In a less frequented corner, behind a particularly dense thicket of philosophical treatises, I discovered a narrow door, almost hidden by an elaborate carved pilaster. It was unlocked. Beyond, a tight, spiraling passage beckoned. I descended, my hand brushing against the rough, cold stone of the inner wall. The spiral continued, tighter and tighter, the steps worn smooth in the center from countless forgotten passages. Then, a peculiar disjunction. I found myself at a landing, identical to the one I had just left. A brief moment of confusion, a frown creasing my brow. Had I somehow ascended without realizing it? I pushed through the same narrow door, and there it was again. The same corner, the same dense thicket of philosophical treatises. I had walked a full circle, finding myself back where I began. Shaking off the momentary disorientation, I decided to focus on the main collection. My methodical nature demanded order, even in the face of such disarray. I started with a shelf near my chosen workspace, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound tome. Its cover, strangely smooth to the touch despite its apparent age, bore no title, only an intricate, embossed pattern of interlocking geometric shapes that seemed to shift subtly under my gaze. I opened it carefully, the brittle pages releasing a puff of fine gray dust. The script within was not Latin, nor Greek, nor any language I recognized. It was a dense, flowing calligraphy, each character a complex arrangement of lines and curves, utterly alien. But it wasn't the script that arrested my attention. It was the material of the pages themselves. They were not paper nor vellum. They were thin, almost translucent, with a faint, fibrous quality, the color of dried blood. My breath caught. My meticulous world, so carefully ordered, suddenly felt precarious. And for the first time in the heart of Blackwood, I felt truly, utterly alone. The robust utility vehicle, a hulking shadow against the bruised twilight, finally stopped. Its engine, a low growl, died with a final shudder, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very air. My driver, a figure perpetually cloaked in taciturnity, simply gestured towards the immense Gothic silhouette that rose before us. The Blackwood Library. I stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the gravel. This was my assignment, my purpose, to tame the wild heart of this place, to bring order to its forgotten chaos. Determination, a fragile flame flickered within me. A single bare bulb suspended from the cavernous ceiling cast a weak yellow pool on the flagstone floor, barely pushing back the encroaching gloom. My workstation, a sturdy, if scarred, oak table, stood beneath the sole functioning light. Beside it, stacks of blank catalog cards awaited their fate. My tools were laid out: fine bristled brushes, archival gloves, a magnifying glass, and a small leather-bound notebook for my observations. The first days were a slow, methodical descent into the labyrinth. I began in the main hall, where towering shelves, reaching dizzyingly towards unseen ceilings, held countless volumes. Each book, a silent sentinel, was caked in layers of fine, silvery dust. My gloved fingers, precise and careful, ran along spines, retrieving a volume, gently brushing away the accumulated years. The work was demanding, a physical and mental excavation. I cataloged, cross-referenced, and reshelved, my mind a quiet engine of order amidst the encroaching disarray. The library initially felt merely old, a grand relic of a forgotten era. It wasn't sound, not truly, but an absence of it that felt pregnant with unspoken things. The creak of settling wood, the faint rustle of dry leaves caught somewhere in the rafters. These sounds, amplified by the pervasive quiet, started to take on a strange, almost intentional quality. My own breathing seemed too loud, my footsteps echoing with an unnatural resonance on the stone floors. I pulled out a volume, its leather binding cracked and brittle, its pages yellowed and flaking. The title, in a looping, archaic script, spoke of local folklore, a harmless enough subject. My fingers, tingling with an odd premonition, closed around a heavy oblong object. It was not a book, not exactly. It was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so, like river stone pulled from a winter current. No title graced its surface, only a series of deep, intricate carvings that snaked across its face. They were not letters, nor symbols I recognized from any known language. They were organic, unsettling, like the root system of some ancient, unseen tree, or the veins beneath sun-starved skin. This was no ordinary artifact. It hummed with a silent intensity that raised the hairs on my arms. The carvings seemed to writhe, to breathe, in the periphery of my vision. I brought it closer, turning it over in my gloved hands. On its reverse, a single etched word, shallow and almost worn away, stood out amidst the chaotic patterns. It was not English, nor Latin, nor any tongue I had encountered in my extensive studies. A faint, almost imperceptible sound drifted from the deeper stacks. A rustling like dry leaves, or perhaps the turning of countless unseen pages, or something else entirely, something that brushed against the edge of hearing, too soft to be defined, too persistent to be ignored. This was not a part of the Blackwood's known collection. It was a secret, hidden and forgotten, until now. My breath caught in my throat. This was not just an archival find. It was an intrusion, a disturbance. The stone steps, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, seemed to stretch endlessly upwards. The stairwell that loops back to the same landing was not a figment of my weary mind. And I, Chen, had just begun to stir its ancient, malevolent heart. Immense, wrought iron gates that guarded the entrance to the Blackwood Library. Their intricate scrollwork, once a testament to forgotten artistry, now resembled grasping skeletal fingers against the dying light. The driver, a silhouette of quiet efficiency, merely nodded, the gesture a dismissal. The vehicle rumbled away, its tail lights shrinking to distant crimson eyes, leaving me utterly alone before the formidable edifice. I pushed through, my footsteps echoing on the gravel path that led to the heavy oak doors. They were carved with symbols I couldn't yet decipher, their surfaces slick with moss and the patina of centuries. A key, heavy and cold in my palm, turned with a grinding protest, and the doors yielded, revealing an abyss of shadow. The air inside was thick, motionless, carrying the ghost of 1,000 stories. My flashlight beam cut a path through the gloom, revealing towering shelves that stretched into the unseen ceiling, laden with books bound in leather, vellum, and materials I couldn't immediately identify. It pressed against my ears, a profound, almost audible quietude. My first task, as assigned by the administrator, was a preliminary survey of the main hall, an architectural marvel swallowed by neglect. It was then, near a section dedicated to obscure cartography, that I first felt it. A sudden, intense drop in temperature, as if a window had been flung open to a winter gale. But the air was still, my brow furrowed. An old building, I reasoned, prone to drafts and eccentricities of temperature. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter, and continued my work, cataloging the strange, faded titles on my digital tablet. The old wood creaked under my weight, a more tangible, explainable sound. I was a meticulous archivist, a person of order and reason. Every anomaly had a logical explanation. I had established a temporary workspace near a large leaded window, its panes depicting forgotten heraldry. It seemed to condense, then dissipate, like smoke, faster than I could properly focus. I snapped my head around, my neck protesting. Nothing. My eyes must be tired, I concluded, squinting at the fine print of the ledger. Long hours in dim light were taking their toll. The true disquiet began that afternoon. I had placed my small leather-bound notebook, an essential tool for impromptu notes, on a specific step while I examined a curious, unlabeled door. When I returned, it was not there. My gaze swept the steps, then the landing. My heart gave a small, unbidden lurch. It was on the step above, where I had left it, turned at a slightly different angle. My mind, a fortress of logic, immediately sought an explanation. Did I knock it? Did it slide? But the steps were broad, the notebook flat. It felt deliberate. I picked it up, its familiar weight suddenly alien in my hand. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. This was not a draft, nor a tired eye, nor a settling beam. This was a disruption of order, a subtle defiance of the known. Each faint creak, each shift in the ancient timbers was scrutinized, reevaluated. Just before twilight bled through the high windows, painting the dust motes in streaks of amber and gray, I made a small, unsettling discovery. Tucked away on a shelf, not with the other periodicals, but among a collection of astronomical charts, was a thin, unbound pamphlet. Its title was simple, etched in faded ink. Observations on the Perpetual Stillness. I pulled it out. The pages were brittle, their edges like delicate lace, but the text was clear, handwritten in a precise, almost clinical script. The rationalizations were growing thin, like worn fabric. A seed of something far more profound, far more terrifying had been planted. The immense wrought iron gates, their skeletal fingers reaching for the twilight, had groaned open with a sound like ancient bones grinding. The driver, a study in muted efficiency, had merely nodded, a gesture of finality, before receding into the encroaching gloom. I stood then, alone, facing the Blackwood Library. Its facade, a Gothic dream in decaying stone, loomed like a forgotten titan, its windows dark, vacant eyes. My footsteps echoed with an alarming clarity across the vast marble-tiled entrance hall. I bypassed it, my initial task to establish a temporary workspace. A side room, once perhaps a reading salon, offered a large, sturdy table, its surface scarred by time. The first few hours were a methodical descent into the mundane. I began to catalog the nearest shelves, pulling out volumes bound in faded leather, their titles mostly forgotten histories, obscure philosophies, and botanical studies of extinct flora. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch required by brittle paper, moved with practiced precision. The work was slow, painstaking, each book a small victory against chaos. Yet a subtle unease began to curdle the air around me. The silence was too profound, too watchful. It felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, holding its breath. Then, tucked away behind a row of unremarkable almanacs, I found it. The paper, unlike the brittle leaves of its companions, was thick, almost vellum-like, with an unnatural resilience. Its edges were not yellowed with age, but stained with a deep, rust-like hue that bled into the fibers. I unwrapped the bundle with a growing sense of trepidation. The first folio contained crude, unsettling etchings. Figures with elongated limbs and eyeless faces, performing strange rites before a swirling vortex. I moved to the next folio. This one contained what appeared to be local newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile despite the peculiar paper they were affixed to. They spoke of unexplained disappearances in the surrounding townships, spanning decades, even centuries. Farmer's daughter vanishes near Blackwood Copse, read one headline, dated 1887. This wasn't just a collection of historical texts. They all seemed to converge on one point: the library itself, or rather what lay beneath it. The journal spoke of foundations of sacrifice, of sustaining the great stillness. My archivist's determination warred with a primal fear. I needed more context, more confirmation. I rose, my movements stiff, compelled to search the deeper, uncatalogued sections of the library. I ventured deeper, following a narrow, winding corridor that promised further forgotten archives. I found a stairwell, its stone steps worn smooth by untold passages, spiraling downwards. And then another, and another. Each turn, each descent, seemed to lead me into an identical space. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, began to falter. I ascended, then descended again, the architectural logic dissolving into a disorienting loop. Again, and again. The same cracked window, the same patch of damp on the wall. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. The library was alive, or something within it was. The great stillness wasn't just a concept. It was a hungry, ancient entity, woven into the very fabric of this place. And my presence, my meticulous cataloging, my digging into its forgotten history, had roused it. My archivist's determination, usually a steadfast companion, flickered like a dying candle in a cavernous draught, warring with a primal fear that clawed at the edges of my composure. I needed more context, more confirmation. I needed to know what the deep silence truly referred to, beyond the cryptic scrawls I had found. My movements were stiff, each step echoing too loudly in the oppressive quiet as I compelled myself towards the deeper, uncatalogued sections of the library. The air grew heavier with each corridor I traversed, thick with the scent of decaying vellum, cold stone, and something else. A faint, metallic tang, like old blood or rusted iron, that seemed to cling to the very air. I would drift into a shallow slumber, only to be yanked awake by a suffocating weight on my chest, the phantom sensation of being buried alive beneath an avalanche of books, their brittle pages scratching at my face. One night, I dreamt of an endless, spiraling descent into a chasm of ink-black water, the pressure building until my very bones threatened to shatter. The lines between waking and nightmare began to blur. I would whip my head around, my eyes scanning the empty aisles, only to find nothing but the dust motes dancing in the meager light filtering through grimy windows. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I indexed new entries, the meticulous order of my work a desperate anchor against the encroaching chaos in my mind. A profound isolation began to settle over me, heavier than any physical burden. There was no one else here, no other voice, no other presence to confirm what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. Was the library truly shifting, its architecture subtly rearranging itself when I wasn't looking? Or was it me? Was my mind, under the strain of this place and its secrets, beginning to fray. I would catch my reflection in the polished surface of an old mahogany table, my face drawn and pale, eyes wide with a fear that seemed too ancient for my own features. I began my descent, my hand gripping the cold metal, my footsteps hushed against the stone. My legs ached, my breath came in short, shallow gasps. I counted the steps, a futile attempt to impose order on the unsettling disorientation. 50, 60, 70 steps. Then the architecture began to feel eerily familiar. The slight crack in the wall, the distinct pattern of moss on a damp patch of stone. I had seen these before. I stopped, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. The same towering shelves, the same dust-laden air, the same faint sliver of light from the passage I had entered. I had not descended. I had merely spiraled, an elaborate deception. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The library was not just old and forgotten. It was actively hostile, a labyrinth designed to trap, to disorient. It was not merely a container. It was an extension, a living manifestation of whatever malevolent force lurked within its foundations. The entity was not just in the library. It was the library, slowly, subtly, bending reality to its will. My determination, once a steady flame, now guttered. I was not just searching for answers. I was caught in a snare, and the walls themselves were closing in. The profound isolation was not just a feeling. It was a deliberate state, enforced by the very architecture of this place. I was truly alone, and the library, a silent, watchful predator, was enjoying the hunt. I stood amidst the towering shelves, the silence no longer peaceful but a heavy, suffocating blanket, woven from dust and untold years. Each shadow seemed to lengthen, to deepen its hold, and the very air tasted of forgotten things. A metallic tang beneath the pervasive scent of mildew and decaying paper. It was the distinct impression of being watched, not by eyes, but by something formless, vast, and infinitely patient. The walls themselves seemed to hum with a low, resonant thrum, a sound so subtle it might have been my own pulse echoing in the cavernous space. Yet it felt external, an emanation from the very stones. I needed to move, to break this suffocating stasis, even if motion only led me deeper into the labyrinth. My hand, trembling slightly, found the cool, smooth wood of a nearby shelf, its surface gritty with a fine film of neglect. The light, already struggling through grimy windows, seemed to recede further with every step, leaving me in a perpetual twilight. I navigated by memory, by the faint glow of my small lantern, its beam cutting a trembling swathe through the gloom. He was a local historian, I vaguely recalled, one of the few who still occasionally visited, though I hadn't seen him in weeks. His name eluded me, lost in the sudden surge of adrenaline. Chen. His voice was a dry rustle, like autumn leaves skittering across forgotten paving stones. You dig too deep. I froze, my hand tightening around the lantern. How did he know my name? I hadn't seen him before, not truly. Who? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he slowly pushed himself up, his movements stiff, as if his bones were protesting the effort. It is a maw, for those who seek the forgotten. He gestured vaguely toward the shelves that loomed around us, their spines a silent testament to countless lost worlds. They are not just books. They are anchors. On understanding, on the unraveling of its own mysteries. Each truth you uncover, each connection you make, it strengthens it. It clarifies its form. You are not archiving, Chen. You are assembling. My mind reeled. Assembling what? The fragments of strange rituals, the unsettling diagrams, the recurring symbols I'd found in the forgotten texts. They were forming a pattern, yes. But I had thought it was a pattern of containment, of history, not a blueprint for its awakening. The foundations, the historian continued, his voice dropping to a near inaudible level. They speak of its confinement. But the texts are the threads of its being. And you, diligent archivist, you are weaving them back together. He took another step, his eyes wide and haunted. It wants to be seen, to be known. And once it is fully known, Chen, it will be fully real. A suffocating wave of understanding crashed over me. They were its nascent awareness, its growing consciousness fueled by my very work. My archival dedication, my meticulous pursuit of order, had been its unwitting catalyst. Escape, the historian rasped, his voice suddenly weak. A fragile thing. He swayed, clutching at the air as if seeking an invisible support, before it finishes its meal. The lantern in my hand flickered violently, threatening to extinguish. When its flame steadied, the historian was gone. Not vanished in a puff of smoke, but simply gone. The space where he had stood was empty, utterly devoid of his presence, as if he had never been there at all. Only a faint, lingering scent of metallic dust remained, sharp and unsettling. The historian was gone. Not a whisper remained of their presence. No lingering scent of their peculiar pipe tobacco. No faint echo of their heavy steps. Only the gnawing chill, a deeper, more profound cold than any mere draft could conjure, filled the space where they had stood. I spun, my gaze frantic, searching the spiraling ascent and descent, the narrow, unyielding walls. It felt foolish, a tiny, futile sound against an impossible absence. I called again, louder this time, the echo swallowed before it could fully bloom. There was no answer, no shuffle of cloth, no distant groan of wood. Yet beneath it, a strange, almost manic clarity began to take root. This was not a simple disappearance. This was an event, an uncatalogued, terrifying data point. My archivist's mind, a trained instrument for order amidst chaos, demanded understanding, demanded proof. The historian had been searching for something specific, a key to the library's true nature, a truth I now felt compelled to unearth. Their vanishing was not an end, but a terrifying, undeniable beginning. I chose a direction, any direction, and began to descend, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the stone. Each landing I passed seemed identical to the last, a dizzying repetition that threatened to unravel my senses. Then, closer, a faint, sibilant sigh that seemed to emanate from the very stone itself. I paused, straining to discern meaning, but it was just a shapeless murmur, a breath exhaled by something ancient and patient. It was as if the library itself had guided me, or perhaps pushed me. My hands, trembling slightly, sifted through brittle blueprints, their edges crumbling to dust at my touch. I sought any anomaly, any deviation from standard construction. Most were mundane, depicting load-bearing walls and ventilation shafts. They showed not simple foundations, but a labyrinthine network of reinforced chambers, descending far deeper than any normal basement, their walls etched with symbols I vaguely recognized from the esoteric texts I had been cataloging. Symbols of binding and warding, but also, disturbingly, of sustenance. There were channels, too, depicted in a crimson ink, snaking through the earth beneath the library, converging on a central point marked only with a single, complex sigil. It wasn't just a building. It was a mechanism. My breath hitched. The library wasn't merely a repository containing the entity. It was a prison, yes, but more than that. The intricate channels, the symbols of sustenance, they implied a symbiotic parasitic relationship. The entity wasn't just trapped within these walls, it was fed by them. Or perhaps the library itself was the entity, its stone and mortar merely a hardened shell, its endless archives a vast silent gullet. The historian's words echoed. It remembers. It is aware. As the horrifying truth solidified in my mind, the library seemed to recoil, then surge. The air around me grew frigid, biting. A low, guttural moan rumbled from the depths beneath my feet, vibrating through the very soles of my boots. Dust, thick and suffocating, billowed up, obscuring my vision, filling my lungs with the taste of decay and something sharper, something metallic and alive. The library was alive. And it was angry. The grand, silent halls had become a living maw, and I, Chen, the meticulous archivist, was no longer merely a researcher, but prey. The guttural moan, a sound ripped from the very bedrock of the world, vibrated through my bones, a symphony of ancient agony. Around me, the cascade of books had ceased, leaving behind a battlefield of scattered pages and broken spines. Terror, raw and unyielding, clawed at my throat. This wasn't just a library anymore. It was a prison, and I, Chen, was its latest captive. But I refused to be a lost soul. I refused to simply wither. If this entity had been contained once, if its malevolence had been recorded, then somewhere, buried beneath layers of dust and despair, lay the key to its undoing. Or, failing that, the path to my own escape. My gaze swept across the chaotic floor, past the overturned carts and the mournful drift of liberated pages. The forbidden sections, those locked, lightless archives I had only ever glimpsed through grimy glass, now beckoned with a terrifying urgency. They were the repository of everything the library's former custodians had sought to bury, to forget. Each step was a battle against the rising tide of panic. My breath hitched, a thin, ragged sound in the immense space. I found the entrance to the restricted wing, not locked as I remembered, but slightly ajar, as if inviting me into its maw. I hesitated, my hand trembling on the cold metal of the doorframe. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee. But the guttural moan still resonated in my ears, a promise of inevitable doom if I lingered. This was my only path. Books, bound in strange leathers and metals, lay undisturbed for centuries. I ran my fingers along their spines, a desperate, frantic search for any symbol, any word that might offer a clue. The entity, however, was not content to merely observe. As I moved deeper, a soft scratching sound began, like countless tiny claws scuttling over distant wood. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the fleeting, shapeless forms persisted. My search became increasingly frantic. I pulled books from shelves, letting them fall open to reveal indecipherable scripts, grotesque etchings, or simply blank yellowed pages. Nothing. My hands began to ache, my vision blurred from strain. Then, as I tried to access a particularly high shelf, laden with large, chained tomes, the library itself began to conspire against me. I remembered it from my initial cataloging, a peculiar architectural quirk. I ascended, my boots echoing on the worn steps, reaching for the elusive volume. I climbed and climbed, the railing slick with an invisible film of dampness. Yet when I looked up, the same landing, the same unreached shelf stretched above me. I tried again, my pace quickening, a frantic desperation seizing me. Up, the steps groaning under my weight. And still, the same landing, the same mocking vista of the unreached books. The entity was playing with me, twisting the very architecture of the building, turning my path into an endless, frustrating loop. My throat tightened with a choked cry of rage and despair. I descended, stumbled, feeling the library's mocking gaze. My legs burned, my head throbbed. I was trapped, not by physical barriers, but by a malevolent will that bent space itself. My determination wavered, replaced by a crushing sense of futility. Driven by a primal instinct, I stumbled towards it, my lantern beam shaking wildly. Behind a facade of seemingly ordinary leather-bound volumes, a narrow, dust-choked alcove became visible. It was so well hidden, so perfectly disguised, I might have walked past it 100 times. Inside, nestled on a small, unadorned shelf, lay a single small book. As I pulled it free, a faint, resonant hum vibrated through my palm. I opened it, my heart hammering against my ribs. The pages were thick, parchment-like, covered in a script I had never seen before, a swirling, serpentine language that seemed to shift and writhe under my gaze. But amidst the alien text, a single faded diagram stood out. It depicted a complex arrangement of symbols, a circle enclosing a stylized, jagged form, radiating lines of power. And beneath it, a half-erased inscription, rendered in a language I recognized as an ancient form of Latin, though fragmented and almost illegible. The vessel, the anchor, bound, within the heart, to quiet the hunger. My breath hitched. The vessel. Not a containment spell, not an escape route, but a ritual of binding. The diagram, incomplete as it was, spoke of a physical object, something crucial, something within the library itself, that acted as a tether, a prison for the entity. The entity wasn't merely in the library. It was part of it, its malevolence anchored to something tangible. A new, terrifying clarity pierced through the fog of my fear. This was not about banishment. It was about recontainment. And the object, the vessel, the anchor was still here. It had to be. The scratching sound intensified, now accompanied by a low, mournful sigh that seemed to emanate from the very air I breathed. The entity knew. It knew I had found a piece of its truth, and it would ensure I never found the rest. My desperate search had just begun. The revelation of the vessel, not as a means of escape, but a cruel, intricate tether, had clarified the fog that had been settling over my mind. The entity was not merely in the library. It was the library. Or rather, its malevolent heartbeat within some physical anchor buried deep in these foundations. And I, in my meticulous pursuit of order, had roused it, A cold, hard resolve settled in my bones, displacing the creeping dread. I would find this vessel. I would re-establish the binding, or I would be consumed trying. The silence, once merely oppressive, now hummed with a nascent, terrible energy. Corridors I remembered as straight now twisted, their perspectives warping like reflections in disturbed water. I found myself on a grand, sweeping stairwell that looped back to the same landing, its ornate banister slick with a film of unseen moisture. I descended, then ascended, then descended again, the familiar architecture mocking my progress, until I realized the futility of fighting its illusion. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the library's pull guide me, not its visual tricks. When I opened them, the stairwell was behind me, and a narrow, unlit passage yawned ahead. This passage was different. The air here was still, thick, devoid of the usual dusty drafts. It tasted of earth and something ancient, like the inside of a tomb. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate heartbeat, growing subtly stronger with each step I took. The passage opened into a chamber. It was not grand, nor filled with esoteric artifacts. It was a simple, circular room carved from the bedrock beneath the library. The ceiling was low, the walls unadorned except for a single shallow alcove directly opposite where I stood. And in the center of the flagstone floor, flush with the cold stone, was the vessel. It bore no lock, no hinges, no visible seams, just a solid, seamless block of worked iron, sunk into the stone as if it had grown there. This was the anchor. This was the heart. The air around the box was visibly distorted, shimmering as if seen through rising heat, yet the chamber itself was frigid. The entity was here. My thoughts, usually so clear and precise, began to fray at the edges, dissolving into a buzzing static. But the resolve held. I remembered the fragments, the incomplete diagram, the cryptic notes. The binding was not merely a physical object. It was an interaction, a ritual to be performed upon the object. It was the key. With trembling hands, I retrieved the book from my satchel. The thrumming from the iron box deepened, becoming a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the soles of my feet. The entity was aware. It was resisting. I forced myself forward, one foot in front of the other, each step an act of defiance against the crushing weight of its presence. My breath hitched in my throat, each inhalation a struggle. As I neared the vessel, the iron box seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, a dim, sickly red that seeped from its seamless surface. The air around it crackled with an unseen energy, raising the fine hairs on my arms. I knelt before it, the cold stone biting into my knees. The lead-bound book felt impossibly heavy in my hands. I focused, forcing my gaze to hold steady, to interpret the instructions I had painstakingly pieced together. The ritual was simple, yet profound. It required focus, intent, and the precise placement of the sacred text. I had to re-establish the connection, to channel the will of the original binders through the book into the vessel and back into the entity. With a deep, shuddering breath, I placed the lead-bound book precisely on the center of the iron box. The moment it touched, a deafening crack echoed through the chamber, not from the box, but from the very air itself, as if the fabric of reality had torn. The red glow from the vessel intensified, throbbing with a malevolent light that cast my face in a ghastly pallor. It was the entity's full, incomprehensible power, unleashed in a desperate bid to repel me, to break my will. I felt its ancient hatred, its raw, boundless hunger, its infinite patience all focused on me, a single, insignificant human attempting to bind it once more. My vision blurred, tears stinging my eyes, not from sorrow, but from the sheer, overwhelming force pressing against my skull. I tasted copper in my mouth, and a searing pain erupted behind my eyes. I was being torn apart, piece by piece from the inside out. But I held. I gripped the edges of the book, my knuckles white, my whole body trembling. I focused on the words, on the intent, on the desperate hope that this ancient binding could be renewed. The chamber roared around me, not with sound, but with a silent, consuming fury. The air was alive, thick with the entity's protest, its ancient, terrible voice screaming in the deepest caverns of my mind. The silence, when it finally settled, was not a balm, but a suffocating weight. It pressed against my eardrums, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated not through the air, but through the very bone of my skull. I lay amidst a scattering of crumbled masonry and torn vellum, the tang of ozone and ancient dust sharp in my nostrils. The air, once heavy with the library's slow decay, now felt thinner, brittle, as if the very atmosphere had been stretched taut and threatened to snap. My limbs were leaden, each muscle a knot of protest. To lift an arm felt like hauling a timber beam. A profound exhaustion had burrowed into my marrow, a weariness that transcended mere physical exertion. It was the fatigue of having wrestled with something vast and timeless, of having pushed back against an encroaching tide that sought to swallow not just my body, but the very notion of my existence. I had not defeated it, no. The thought was laughable, a child's boast against a mountain. But I had, I believed, contained it, forced it back into its deep, lightless slumber, its malevolent heart once more sealed within the bedrock of these foundations. A tremor coursed through my hand as I pushed myself upright. My fingers, usually so precise, felt clumsy, alien. The skin was rough, as if I had spent days sifting through coarse sand, and a faint, persistent ache throbbed beneath the nails. My eyes, however, were the most unsettling. They saw too much. The faint luminescence of dust motes suspended in the air was now a dizzying galaxy. The intricate patterns in the cracked plaster of the ceiling, once merely a sign of age, seemed to writhe with hidden geometries, whispering of impossible designs. The library, my sanctuary, my archive, felt different. It was quieter, yes, but the quiet was not empty. It was filled with a tension, a held breath. The subtle creaks and groans that usually punctuated its vastness were gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness. It was as if the building itself had been stunned into a profound, unnatural slumber. Its ancient timbers hushed, its stones muted. Yet, beneath this quietude, I sensed a vast, dormant power, a deep pulse that resonated with the ache in my own chest. I began to move, each step a deliberate act against the inertia that clung to me. My goal was unclear, a vague need to reach a space where the air felt less charged, where the silence was not so absolute. I remembered its trickery, its endless circuit that defied logic. Before, it had been a manifestation of the entity's playful malice, a subtle twist of reality. Its wrought iron railings, once merely dusty, now seemed to absorb the light, their intricate spirals hinting at an impossible depth. I placed a foot on the first step, a ripple of unease tracing its way up my leg. It was not just the illusion of endlessness that disturbed me now. It was the feeling of it. I reached the landing, the familiar alcove with its empty plinth, and turned to descend, only to find myself back on the same landing, facing the same empty alcove. A laugh, raw and unbidden, escaped my throat. It was a sound devoid of humor, a brittle, desperate thing. This was not a trick of the mind. It was a truth. I was bound. I tried again and again. Each ascent, each descent, brought me back to the same point. A profound weariness, heavier than any I had known, settled upon me. It was not just exhaustion. It was a dawning realization. The containment, the fragile peace I had wrought, had come at a terrible price. The entity was no longer in the library in the way a creature inhabits a cage. It was of the library, and I, in my desperate act of pushing it back, had become irrevocably linked to it, a vital part of its new, silent prison. The true cost of my victory was not just my sanity, but my freedom, myself. The library had consumed me, not violently, but subtly, inexorably. I was another archive, another repository for its terrible secrets, endlessly circling a stairwell that led nowhere but back to myself. Something that had clawed at the periphery of my awareness. Something that had been there. A presence, vast and ancient, now receded, but its imprint lingered like a bruise on the air. A tremor ran through me, not of cold, but of a profound, disorienting vacancy. A desperate, primal urge for air, for light, for anything that was not this suffocating quiet, seized me. My legs, leaden moments before, found a sudden, jarring strength. I had to leave. The thought was a sharp, clear command in the ringing aftermath. I stumbled forward, each step an act of defiance against the invisible currents that seemed to drag at my clothes, at my hair. Dust motes, caught in the slivers of weak light filtering through distant, grimy windows, danced like frantic, forgotten spirits. The grand hall, once a place of quiet contemplation, now stretched before me like a yawning maw. My gaze flickered to a distant, barely visible exit. A side door, rarely used, leading to the alley behind the library. It was a slender thread of hope, but I clung to it with the desperation of a drowning person. As I moved, the floorboards groaned beneath my weight, a low, drawn-out complaint that seemed to vibrate up through my soles. The sounds of the library, once muted and scholarly, were now exaggerated, sinister. A distant drip echoed like a falling stone. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by the very walls, the very dust. I reached the main stairwell, a spiraling ascent that I knew led upwards, away from the deeper archives. But as I placed my foot on the first step, a peculiar sensation washed over me. One flight, then another. The landing should have been a wide expanse, a place to catch my breath before the next ascent. But when I reached it, the architecture had warped. The landing was not a landing. It was the beginning of another flight of stairs, identical to the one I had just climbed. And beyond that, another and another. I was caught in a horrifying, impossible loop. The stairwell that loops back to the same landing. A cruel, mocking trick of the library, or the entity's final subtle grasp. My breath hitched in my throat. I pressed my palms against my eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to dislodge the illusion, to reset my perception. This was its last test, its final attempt to break me, to make me another forgotten soul in its labyrinthine depths. But I had seen too much, endured too much. I would not yield. I turned, not upwards, but downwards, back the way I came, trusting my internal compass over the library's deceitful architecture. Each step was deliberate, a small victory. I kept my eyes fixed on the distant, faint glimmer of the side door. The scent of dust gave way to something fresher, though still tainted with damp earth and something vaguely metallic. The light grew, not bright, but a gray, muted wash that promised an outside world. I pushed against the heavy oak door. It groaned, a deep, resonant sound of protest, and then yielded with a sudden, jarring thud. I stumbled out, blinking against the muted afternoon light. The alley was narrow, cobbled, slick with recent rain. The library's massive stone rear facade loomed behind me, its windows like vacant eyes. I walked, then ran, not looking back, my lungs burning, my legs aching, until I reached the street. The world outside was a cacophony of sound. Distant traffic, the chatter of a passing pedestrian, the rustle of wind through autumn trees. But it was all wrong. The colors seemed muted, leached of their vibrancy. The sounds were distant, as if filtered through a thick pane of glass, or perhaps through the bone of my own skull. I looked down at my hands. They were pale, trembling. I clenched my fists, then released them, but the sensation persisted. It was as if a fine, invisible film had settled upon everything, dulling the world, separating me from it. A passerby, a young woman with a bright scarf, glanced at me, her expression momentarily creasing with concern before she hurried on. Did she see it too? Or was it only I who now perceived the world through this new, unsettling lens? I continued to walk, each step carrying me further from the Blackwood Library, but not, I knew, from its influence. The hum, that deep, resonant vibration, still echoed in my skull. The phantom embers still danced at the edges of my vision. And now its residue clung to me, a subtle, insidious stain. The entity had not been recontained. It had not been defeated. It had simply changed vessels.